So welcome once again to our webinar session on immigration and citizenship. This is part of the Your Voice campaign, which is being sponsored and in partnership between the Canadian Arab Institute and the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. So I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Rula Aoudi. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations. It's an organization that seeks to promote understanding about the Arab world, the people of the Arab world, and to enhance relations between Canadians and the people of the Arab world. We are located, our head office is located actually in Ottawa, but we do have members across the country. We have several programs. One is we bring in speakers, well-known speakers to provide educational seminars. We've had panel discussions, for example, with MPs. We do offer parliamentary interns. This is one of our parliamentary interns who has been working with MPs on the Hill over this few weeks, over the summer, which is an excellent career booster for them and excellent experience. And we also have, if you haven't had a chance to take a look, we have some excellent magazines called Perspectives magazines, which cover opinions and analysis that appear in the international media, in Canadian media. We have one that's focused specifically on security, rights, and freedoms, and also another one on identity politics, because that's been coming up in various political settings. So we encourage you to take a look at those. You'll find them a good way to get a good perspective and to keep up to date. And now I'll pass it on to Raja, who's going to tell us a little bit about the Canadian Arab Institute and the Your Voice campaign.
Hello, everyone. Raja Khouri, the president of the Canadian Arab Institute. In the same way that NCAR is there to talk to other Canadians about the Arab world, the Canadian Arab Institute is here to talk to other Canadians about Canadian Arabs in particular. We are not a known entity, in this country. We are known more by images that are imported from overseas, and our community is often misunderstood, as we all know. So the CI is a think tank that came as an idea 2011, has been fully operational for a little over 2 years, and the idea is to talk to other Canadians, as I said, about the Canadian Arabs, promote their successes, a better understanding of who they are, their heritage, their culture, do research that explores the opportunities and the challenges that they face, as well as provide opportunities for the community to develop itself and become better citizens and better engaged in society. So our vision is about two things. It's about an empowered community, an engaged community, and it's also about a respectful society. So in that sense, we work with the community and with the larger society, and it's to promote Canadian interests by researching and articulating a perspective and potential of Canadian Arabs. So it's very much really about Canadian Arabs, their contributions, and advancing their contributions, making them known. And the way we do that is through three priorities: through research that is directed at policymakers, so that they better understand where the community is coming from, what are its challenges and opportunities; through education directed at the Canadian public in general; and through community engagement directed at our own community, so that we are better engaged in the life of the country. So Your Voice is very much within the last priority of engagement, and the need for this campaign, which was really to get people to realize the importance of participating in the democratic process and becoming engaged citizens. And voting is the first step. It's not the last step, not by any means, but certainly it's the first step to becoming engaged. And if you don't vote, then you're really not part of the conversation. You're not part of shaping the society that we live in and its future. So we came up with this campaign, and we're working with a number of organizations like NCAR the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, the Arab Community Center of Toronto, and many others in other cities to send that message out. And the way we've been doing that is through this kind of webinar, which brings to the fore an issue that is important to us, immigration and citizenship, and bring awareness about how this issue has been developing over the years and where the different parties stand on it today, so that people are better informed when they go to the polls on October 19th. So we've been going to events to talk to people there. We've had panels. We've got all kinds of activities happening. A contest. We launched something recently called a feature called Arab Faces of Canada, to talk about these are the people in the community. And some of you might have seen the Arabic version of O Canada that we launched just before Canada Day, and has been tremendously successful. It was to bring attention to the fact that there is a campaign going on, that we are citizens, that we have a duty, that we should be engaged. Dr. Abu-Laban is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. Among her many research interests are the subjects of immigration policies and politics and citizenship theory, which are obviously very relevant to our discussion today. In addition to over 80 published scholarly articles and book chapters, she is co-editor or editor of a number of journals and publications. And she's co-author of Selling Diversity, Immigration, Multiculturalism, Employment Equity, and Globalization. Dr. Abu-Laban sits on the editorial board or the boards of a number of organizations. She has given numerous invited presentations across Canada and internationally. And in 2013, she was awarded a Killam Professorship on the basis of outstanding scholarship and teaching, and a record of substantial contributions to the community. Most important of all, of course, is that Dr. Abu-Laban is a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Arab Institute, and we're very proud to have her as part of the team. Over to you, Yasmeen.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Raja. And really, I'd like to extend my thanks both to the Canadian Arab Institute and the National Council on Canada-Arab Relations for this invitation to speak, and also for their work on putting together this webinar. I have to say, I've never been involved in a webinar before, so this is a first for me. My fear was the bad webinar, right? And part of the challenge is, of course, that I can only see a couple of people up on the screen, and there's a lot of people out there. And I really work to overcome my fears of not having that sort of face-to-face interaction that I value, because I see it as really important for Canadians of Arab descent, and really all Canadians, to be thinking about elections and voting, to be thinking about our rights as Canadian citizens. And really, one of the things I wanted to alert you to, though, is that within political science today, we're really grappling with something, and that is the fact that in the so-called established democracies of the West, what we've seen is this trend of declining voter participation. And so when we talk about voter participation, it's looking at the percent of the population that's eligible to vote that actually comes out to vote. And what we see is that it's progressively gotten lower over time if you compare from the 1950s until today. And there's been a lot of work in my discipline of political science on why this is happening, and on questions of the youth and voting, and the fact that young people have especially low rates of voting. Now, this is also something that we can see in relation to Canada, that there's a pattern at the federal level. As I noted, political scientists look at this in terms of the percent of the eligible population that actually votes. And what we've seen in Canada federally is that it's gone from somewhere in the neighborhood of the mid to high 1960s for much of the post-World War II era, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, to now somewhere in the neighborhood of the 50-ish% coming out to vote. In the last election of 2011, it was about 55% of the eligible population coming out to vote in Canada. Now, If you look at other levels of governance and government in Canada, you also see this pattern. I want to talk to you a little bit about Alberta, partly because I'm an Albertan, and people in the West are always wanting to talk about their particular situation in Canada, but also because something really interesting happened in the most recent election of 2015. So, before the election, there were predictions that the turnout would be as low as 40%. And in fact, in elections in Alberta, there have been recent elections where you've had about 40% coming out. So, for example, the 2008 election in Alberta had 40% of the population or the electorate coming out to vote. And in fact, this concern was such that Alberta Elections, which is the nonpartisan body that oversees the elections in the province, had this major campaign aimed especially at younger Albertans. They were using social media and a bunch of stuff to try and get them to vote, to realize that they had a right to vote, to make sure that they were registered to vote, and so on. Now, what was really exciting and different and goes against a bunch of trends that we've been seeing is that this did not come to pass. And in fact, the whole declining voter turnout trend actually turned around in the May 2015 election. So the May 2015 election saw the highest voter turnout in over 16 years in Alberta, and you had about 58% of the eligible population coming out to vote. Now, you know, of course, from the news that the election in Alberta resulted in this major change. That is, after 44 years of the government in power being the Progressive Conservative Party, the New Democrats took over as government. So this was a major change and generated a lot of media interest across Canada. But what you might not know unless you live in Alberta was how different it was to see so many people who were engaging in conversations about the election. I mean, it was really something to kind of talk to people, even in their 30s and beyond, that had never voted, and to hear them talk about being excited to vote and realizing that it's a right of their citizenship to vote, that they care and that they can have a say. So I think really the lesson here is the message of Elections Alberta. Don't let others decide for you. That's an important lesson, because when you vote, it doesn't mean that the candidate or the party you support necessarily wins, but there is something in the process of engaging in choosing, even if you lose, that is an important thing. It means you aren't letting others decide for you, and that's really empowering, and that's important in and of itself. So that really, in a nutshell, kind of sums up why I've taken on this webinar format, because it's a way of being able to have a discussion about elections. And in this particular talk, it's a way of being able to have a discussion about immigration specifically. So as Raja indicated, I'm a political scientist who studies migration issues. In my comments today, they're not really geared towards just thinking about partisan statements and political leaders, but really more so about longer term trends around immigration policy. And so what I want to do in this talk is situate immigration and citizenship, not simply in relation to the current government or party leaders, but also in relation to key dimensions of the political economy of international migration since the end of World War II, as well as developments relating to immigration in Canada since the start of the 21st century, so going back some 15 years or so. So explicitly addressing migration is helpful to underscoring that in addition to voting, another really important right associated with citizenship is the right to enter and to legally stay in a country. And so thinking about migration globally and in Canada is also highly pertinent to illuminating certain larger trends relating to who gets in, who gets to stay, who gets citizenship, and who is it that gets to keep citizenship. So my main argument this evening will be that amongst northern states, we're seeing a greater stress on regulating and controlling the movement of people, especially from the global south. And by the global south, I mean developing countries. And we've also been seeing a pattern of deepening state control and restrictions over the extension of citizenship coming from the northern states, the western states, the states that are powerful and economically well off. So to make this argument, I'm going to proceed in two parts. So first I'll consider migration trends in relation to the international political economy since the end of World War II. And then I'll secondly consider Canada in relation to immigration trends that we've been seeing over the past 15 years or so. Okay, so first turning to the political economy of international migration and sort of the big picture since the end of the Second World War. And let me start by noting that the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights is interesting because it supports the idea that people can leave their country, that it's a human right to be able to leave the country where you hold your nationality. But that same document does not include a right to have people enter or stay in a different country. So that's really interesting. And this has led people to talk about mobility as a kind of incomplete human right. Pierre Sonnet, for example, who is a former Director General of UNESCO, which is a major United Nations body, has posited that because a right has posited that a right to movement has not been fully potentiated, that is incomplete. And this is because the right to leave your country is not complemented by a right to enter another country. There is no right to enter another country. And this contradiction really points out the ways in which a right of movement has not been fully potentiated as a human right internationally, and why, consequently, there are contemporary discussions that are engaged by philosophers and sometimes by progressive groups around the idea of open borders or even having no borders. But the reality is we live in a world in which there are states. And the reality is also that those individual states have a lot of power when it comes to who gets in, who gets to stay, who gets citizenship. Now, all that said, there are certain patterns that can be traced in relation to responses from the northern states. And for kind of ease in the discussion, I'm framing this as the three S words. So those three S words are skills, securitization, and sovereignty. And I'm going to say something about each one of these words. So on skills, it's clear that while migration impacts all world regions, the flows have been disproportionately from countries of the South to countries of the North. And that really is a reflection of the fact that there's an unequal division of wealth globally. The unequal division of wealth globally helps propel what economists have referred to as the push factors of immigration. Now, on the other side of things, countries of the North have really wanted to attract those that they see as desirable. And in recent years, what this has involved is a competition amongst northern states, amongst the western states, for those that are highly skilled. So this might be seen as one of the pull factors of migration. So to put this in kind of numeric terms, or put some statistics on this, globally in 2013, there were approximately 232 million migrants worldwide, with over half, so close to 60%, residing in countries of the global north. Of the international migrants residing in northern countries, the majority of them, so 60%, came from developing countries. And then likewise, 86% of those international migrants residing in southern countries also came from developing or southern countries. It's interesting that there are many reports, including from organizations like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is really an organization of the wealthy countries of the world. And those reports are highlighting new ways in which the longstanding concern over a north-south brain drain, that is, when the northern countries want to attract skilled people, they're taking away those skilled people from countries of the developing world, whether it's their doctors or other professionals. So there's this longstanding concern with the brain drain, but that's being combined with a new concern more recently, and that is that many immigrants to northern countries do not always get work that's commensurate or that reflects on those skills that they have, that reflects on those high skills. So they get jobs that they're overqualified for, is another way to put it. So that's one of my S words. Let me turn now to securitization and say something about that. Now, in more recent decades, migrants and refugees in particular have come under suspicion, giving rise to securitization, so that even people that are fleeing the worst of state persecution can be cast as threats rather than as victims. And therefore, if they're a threat, they require a kind of state security response. And what I want to suggest here is that the end of the Cold War really serves to demarcate two very different kinds of approaches to refugees. So, generally speaking, the era of the Cold War lasted basically from 1946 until 1991. So, once the Berlin Wall comes down, you're entering the post-Cold War period. So, in that period of the Cold War, um, for Western states, the offering of asylum served particular interests and goals. So, and one of the things that is important to kind of keep in mind is that the core of the international refugee regime, basically the regime or the rules by which different countries have come to agreement around what they're going to do with refugees, that core international refugee response comes out of the 1951 United Nations Convention. And that convention itself emerged from the context of the 40 million Europeans who were displaced after World War II. And that response also comes out of the Cold War. And so during the Cold War, those fleeing communist persecution really served a function to kind of enhance the propaganda arsenal of liberal democratic countries of the West over the Soviet bloc. Because if people were fleeing, from behind the Iron Curtain, it was saying something about their system. Now, as refugees from countries of the global South increased, and especially once the Cold War ended, the response of Western states really began to shift. There's a very well-known migration scholar, a British migration scholar by the name of Stephen Castles, and he notes that since 1991, the refugee regime of the global North shifted from a system designed to welcome Cold War refugees from the East and to resettle them as permanent exiles in new homes to what he calls a non-entree regime, which is designed to exclude and control asylum seekers from the South. And this non-entry regime has also been justified through what might be called a discursive shift or a shift in language. So this is where this argument about refugees coming to be securitized sort of stems from. Because over the course of the 1980s and 90s and into the present, essentially there's been a shift in the way that refugees are talked about in many accounts given by politicians and others. And in the words of Sharon Aiken, who's a legal scholar, the refugee has been reconceived as the bogus asylum seeker or the illegal migrant, or even worse, a criminal or terrorist. And it should be noted, of course, that this discourse around international terrorism began to really come to the fore in American policies and politics as far back as the 1980s. And at the same time, even in that period, it was associated a lot with countries and groups in the Middle East, along with the Soviet bloc. Now, of course, after 9/11, this discourse on terrorism, this focus on terrorism was further reinforced in northern countries, as was surveillance directed at both citizens and non-citizens, especially those perceived to be Middle Eastern and or Muslim. So that's securitization. Let me turn to my final S word and talk about sovereignty. And when I'm talking about sovereignty, I'm really talking about state sovereignty. So northern states are finding ways to exert sovereignty, to exert their control in relation to migrants. From visa controls to innumerable barriers in, sort of far-flung airports worldwide, northern states have really found ways to increase the ways in which they can control movement. And they have also found all manner of ways, sometimes new ways, of controlling who gets citizenship. One example might be, if you look at the context of Europe, there are numerous long-term residents that live in Europe, many from countries of the developing world. And they do not have the citizenship of the country that they are residing in Europe. And consequently, they also are excluded from a new form of citizenship that's been developing in Europe, which is the European Union citizenship. The way you get European Union citizenship is if you have the nationality of the state that belongs to the European Union. And so if you don't have that nationality, you're excluded from that regional level, that new regional level of citizenship at the level of Europe. Barriers to citizenship also come in the form of the use of temporary migrant labor, as well as more punitive testing for citizenship. And both of these have been features that we've seen increasing in northern states over the past 15 years. But I think perhaps what is most striking is how controls have been directed to refugees. And it's striking because if you think about it, the one seeming exception to the right of movement, the one seeming exception to having a right to enter and stay in a different state than one's nationality might be seen to pertain to refugees. And many countries, most countries around the world have signed on to the United Nations Convention on Refugees. So it may seem like that, but it's interesting and pertinent that northern states have found new means and methods to get around the Refugee Convention. So one way this has been done, for example, is by declaring zones or certain areas of international airports as international. So if it's an international zone, a claim cannot be made by a refugee because they're not in another country. They're in some international zone. France, for example, has done that in recent years. So this widespread and creative use of ways in which northern states have worked in the 21st century to prevent refugees from being able to even make rights claims at all has led Matthew Gibney to talk about 1,000 little Guantanamos. And that's really a takeoff on the, of course, infamous US-run Guantanamo Bay detention camp. So why does he talk about 1,000 little Guantanamos? Well, that's because states have found ways to operate outside of international law, outside sometimes of domestic law, as well as pressures of human rights groups when it comes to refugees through a variety of measures that prevent the arrival of refugees or the claims of refugees from being heard. So as it stands, the bulk of refugees are in countries of the developing world. Their numbers are growing such that the Migration Policy Institute, which is a US-based think tank, has noted that the number of forcibly displaced people in the world today is the largest humanitarian crisis since the end of the Second World War. In 2014, the total number of people forcibly displaced had reached a staggering 51.2 million. About 17% of these 17 million of these 51.2 million would be defined by the United Nations as refugees. Others would largely be internally displaced as a result of conflict within their countries of origin. So they're still in their conflict, they're still within their countries of origin, but in areas or regions that are not where they were originally inhabiting. It can also be noted that the refugee experience and impact is uneven. So in 2014, half of refugees worldwide came from just 3 countries, which were Syria, Iraq, and Somalia. And the bulk of the world's refugees, as I said, are located in countries of the global south. So that's the picture kind of globally and in relation to northern states. So let me turn to talk more about Canada and think more about Canada specifically. And here, I think when we're looking at Canada, it becomes clear that recent developments reflect on many of the broad patterns I've outlined internationally in relation to northern states. One thing about Canada, however, is that it continues to seek more immigrants and annually lets in somewhere in the order of 250 to 300,000 people for permanent settlement. That is for the chance to acquire Canadian citizenship. Conservative government leader Stephen Harper is right when he says that the Conservatives have supported high open immigration in this sense, in terms of the numbers. When you're looking more closely at what kind of happens there, you see that there's an emphasis on attracting immigrants with high levels of skills and education, and increasingly extant offers of employment. So I think earlier, before we started the webinar, Dina had asked a question about international students and whether getting a job puts you on the right path to entry into Canada. And that is an important feature that we're seeing. And like, as I said, even having extant offers of employment, is being stressed more than it was in the past. Now, while Canada continues to demand more immigrants and admit many that are what the Canadian government refers to as visible minorities or racialized minorities coming from the developing world, there's many that are admitted. At the same time, what we've seen over the past 15 years is that there are these developments which speak to growing securitization, immigration and refugee restrictions, and some citizenship exclusions. So, for example, since 9/11, especially, there have been some renewed policy emphases, even justifications for security and surveillance, which differentially impacts those Canadians or non-citizen residents who are perceived to be Muslim and or Arab. The post 9/11 securitized environment has made it more acceptable to detain unwanted immigrants and refugee claimants in detention centers. And when we're talking about detention centers, that's essentially, medium security prisons. So today, Canada is the only Western country that has no limits on how long migrants are detained. And the number of detainees has been actually growing. So that's something we've seen. As well, the 21st century has been one characterized by growing forms of socioeconomic inequality that intersect with ethnicity and race. So we have numerous Canadian studies pointing to the more difficult situation that faces many incoming immigrants, even if they're selected for having high skills, that essentially they haven't had the same kind of labor market success now, today, as they once had, say, in the 1970s and 1980s. And this really echoes the concerns raised globally that high-skilled immigrants may end up in jobs they're overqualified for in northern states. The other thing we've been seeing in Canada, especially over the 2000s, is the increased use of temporary migrant workers who are outright denied Canadian citizenship because they're temporary. They're there to work. And in fact, in 2006, for the first time, the number of people admitted for temporary entry exceeded those that were let in for permanent residence. And then, not least, you have things like the provisions of the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. This is an agreement that went into force in 2004, and this legislation has served to dramatically cut refugee claims heard in Canada by over 2/3. So if you go back to the early 2000s, it was around 30,000 claims a year that were heard in Canada. Now it's down to 10,000 claims. So in policy terms, what the US-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement says is that an asylum seeker must make their claim in the country where he or she first arrived, so either in Canada or the US. And this applies to the land border ports of entry only, with some exceptions. So for example, if a family member is present in the state, or if the claim is being made by an unaccompanied minor, so by a child. So all of these things that point to immigration and citizenship exclusions were in place and in play long before Stephen Harper came to power in 2006 as Prime Minister. However, I would say that recent legislation passed by the Harper Conservatives on refugees in 2012 and on citizenship in the form of Bill C-24 take these exclusions to another height. So Bill C-24 was passed into law in June of 2014, and its provisions just took effect in June of this year, so just a couple of months ago. And these provisions expand the grounds upon which Canadian citizenship can be revoked or taken away, particularly from dual citizens. So let me say something a little more about all this legislation that's come out in really recent years. So first I'll address refugees. This trend to smaller refugee intake can be anticipated to be furthered by the most recent refugee legislation, which came into effect in 2012, the Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act, or Bill C-31, and the Balanced Refugee Reform Act, or Bill C-11. The ministerial discretion, so there's discretion left to the Minister of Immigration and Citizenship, to the bureaucracy, to determining whether a country produces refugees or not. And the fact that irregular arrivals can face automatic detention, which, as I said, means something akin to a prison. These are features that have been widely deemed to be problematic by many analysts as well as many human rights groups. Now, these trends towards restrictiveness also characterize the extension of citizenship. So to put it kind of bluntly, even if one is selected to be a permanent resident and a potential citizen, it's harder to get Canadian citizenship, and it's becoming easier to lose it. And I think this really comes out quite clearly with Bill C-24. So Bill C-24 was dubbed by the Conservative government as the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act, and it was justified by Immigration Minister Chris Alexander as necessary to, quote, protect and strengthen the great value of Canadian citizenship, and to remind individuals that citizenship is not a right, it's a privilege. So the kind of language associated with the bill, implicating all immigrants, new citizens, and dual citizens, is really reminiscent of the long-standing securitization discourse around refugees. And so we're seeing this kind of idea that Canadian citizenship needs to be strengthened, that Canadian citizenship itself needs to be protected. But in the name of strengthening Canadian citizenship, new citizens and dual citizens are actually being placed in what many would see as a much more vulnerable position. So if you look more specifically at Bill C-24, what this new law does is a number of things. One is that it requires permanent residents to wait 4 as opposed to 3 years to be eligible for citizenship. And so there's various ways of counting that. And I think, again, prior to formally starting the conversation, there was a question raised about or an observation raised about the amount of time and days spent in order to acquire Canadian citizenship, especially if you have business ties or other things abroad. And so that's become a more real concern for people because the amount of time they have to be seen to have spent in Canada has come up. It has increased as a result of this legislation. It opens the door to imposing higher fees to apply for citizenship. What the new legislation does is it requires permanent residents from the ages of 18 to 64 to take an official language test or demonstrate official language knowledge, as well as a knowledge of Canada test. When previously this was only required of people from 18 to 55 years of age. Now, none of this is neutral because fees are a burden, especially for some immigrants. And the knowledge of Canada requirement already clearly favors certain groups over others. And in particular, there have been some changes to the citizenship test that we're seeing has served to kind of favor those coming from countries that are predominantly English speaking, like the United States and Great Britain, who've tended to fare very well on that test, as compared to people coming from places like Vietnam or Afghanistan. So these kinds of changes are not necessarily neutral when you look at what the impact seems to be. Just as it's been made harder to get Canadian citizenship, the Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act makes it easier to revoke it or to take it away, at least for naturalized Canadians and dual citizens. And this can be done if federal officials hold that a naturalized citizen did not intend to live in Canada, that the person committed a crime or fraud or acted, quote, contrary to the national interest of Canada. And the other thing is that if citizenship is revoked, there are no grounds of appeal in federal court. So these broad categories for revoking citizenship have raised the concerns for many different NGOs, for many analysts of citizenship, from legal scholars and others. And that's also included, actually, the Canadian Arab Institute, which has a policy brief that notes that this aspect may disproportionately and unfairly affect Canadians of Arab origin. And I think here it's quite relevant to consider the lessons of, for example, dual citizen Mahar Arar, who was falsely accused of terrorism, who was deported or more accurately rendered to torture in Syria, and where it was clear that there was enough complicity by Canadian officials that Prime Minister Harper eventually delivered an apology and individual compensation. So I think the lessons of the Arar case really underscore the possible dangers of false information and really account for some of the fears being raised and fears expressed about the possible uneven impact of citizenship revocation. So to wrap up, as I've suggested, across northern states, we're seeing a greater stress on regulating and controlling the movement of people, as well as deepening state control over the extension of citizenship. And Canada's really been reflected rather than bucking a larger trend in recent legislative changes like Bill C-24. So let me turn to just briefly consider the main federal parties. And here I'll just take my cue from the recent English language debate and speak specifically about the Conservatives, the New Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals. So it's really interesting when you look at the four parties that all the parties support continued immigration intake around the levels that the Conservatives have been doing. So there is support for continued, permanent immigration, for permanent residents in Canada, for people to come in as permanent residents. And like the Conservatives, all of the other main parties have supported the idea of multiculturalism. And I think that's really interesting because in many European countries, you have not seen this in recent years, right? Many European countries, politicians and uh, party platforms have been saying things like, multiculturalism is dead, or multiculturalism has failed, or we want zero immigration. So we really don't hear those kinds of things in Canada. And on the plus side, that means that um, there's the political parties haven't fed into the kind of racism, the kind of xenophobia that you've seen in Europe, where political parties, especially far right, but also mainstream parties and parties of the left sometimes have fed um, this kind of negative uh, discourse or language that feeds into racism. So there is this consensus amongst the parties on multiculturalism and on having immigrants, that Canada needs immigrants. But there are some qualitative differences between the parties. So I'll just briefly say what I'm sort of taking from some of the campaign language and discussions that have been coming out. Um, the Conservatives have not had a lot of major new promises being made on immigration. So I think you can infer from that that they'll probably continue what they are doing. So there'll be kind of an emphasis on skilled immigrants, maybe fast tracking skilled immigrants, supporting temporary workers schemes. On refugee intake, it's interesting that recently Prime Minister Harper pledged to take in 10,000 more from Syria. So 10,000 more refugees that are coming from Syria, but there have been these, sometimes criticisms raised that this is happening kind of at a snail's pace. If you look at the New Democrats, what you see in terms of what they're saying is that they would like to have more pathways to citizenship. So they tended to be quite critical of the temporary foreign worker program for not giving citizenship and for not providing either employers or workers with the stability that would come with knowing that people were on a pathway to permanent status to having Canadian citizenship. They say they value Canadian citizenship as well. They want Canadian citizenship laws that take action on backlogs for acquiring citizenship and on backlogs for having families reunite. And they tend to, favor more, somewhat more generous responses to refugees and ways that Canada may intervene. The Liberals have been very critical of the wait times for citizenship as well. In one statement, there was a Liberal MP who complained about quadrupling fees and doubling waiting times, especially through testing. So they're very critical of that element. That they see that there are delays in the reunification of families. They've been critical of cuts to healthcare for refugees. And they've been critical to what they see as the Conservative government kind of dragging its feet on admitting refugees from Syria and have called for expanded targets in the neighborhood of 25,000. The Green Party is interesting because it's been critical of ways in which the civil liberties of immigrants and refugees may be trampled. And they have a kind of interesting platform where they talk about being true to the past as an open and just country, but also being geared for the future by being prepared for a predicted increase in the number of environmental refugees. So that is kind of interesting because the other parties don't talk about environmental refugees. So they're calling for a kind of national discussion on including an environmental refugee category in Canadian immigration law and for advocating for Canada to respond and take its fair share globally. Now, one of the things there is that environmental refugees have not been an area where there's been a lot of movement internationally. It's not something that where you have the same kind of agreements that we have on refugees as defined in the United Nations Refugee Convention, which really related to political factors that may cause people to have to flee their country of origin. When people talk about environmental refugees, they're really getting at the idea of people who may, because of tsunamis, because of environmental changes, global warming or other things that may cause tsunamis or cause entire island states to collapse in the ocean, or those kinds of scenarios. And there, so the Green Party wants to talk about it. There's not been a lot of discussion compared to some other issues at the international level on that question. Green Party is also calling to end temporary worker program. So that's kind of where I read those political parties to be at. I'm going to close off here. I've talked for quite a while, but I look forward to the question period. Thank you.
I have a question for Professor Abu-Laban. Um, the change that was made in the immigration policy that will expedite people who have being matched with employers. The I'm not sure what the exact name for that provision is, but this is where employer and employee are matched on, and then that person gets priority immigration processing time and so on. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, it looks like there's an inherent bias in that kind of system towards certain countries or geographic areas. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, I think that's a good question. I mean, anytime we're looking at immigration policy, I think it's relevant to be thinking about whether provisions are actually neutral when they're presented as neutral, right? So, just as an example, if we look at immigration policy in Canada historically, we know it was not neutral at all. It was explicitly discriminatory up until the 1960s, in saying, we want people from, European countries, essentially, right? That the preference was given to people coming from those countries. Preference was given to people that spoke English. There were all kinds of things that worked in the immigration policy to favor those coming from European countries over those coming from non-European countries. So then in the 1960s, you had a big change. And that's really, in some ways, where you start to get more emphasis placed on skills. And I think we've seen that sort of increase ever more since the 1960s. But the way they got rid of that kind of ethnic or racially based discrimination was to start saying, we're going to look at skills. And that's where you got the point system, right in that period. They said, okay, well, we'll treat everybody the same, and we'll look at, do they have the languages that Canada wants? Do they have French and English? What kind of education do they have? And we'll measure everybody on the basis of skills. So we're not going to look at ethnicity or race at all. We're just going to look at these skills. But then, those things, if you look closely, are not necessarily neutral, because, who is it that gets access to education in English or education in French? Who is it that, may be more likely to be able to move? One of the things we know is that embassies are not evenly distributed. There's many more Canadian embassies to go and apply to immigrate to Canada in countries of Europe than there are in countries of Africa. And so those are the kinds of things that you need to look at in relation to whether a provision is really neutral or not. So I can certainly see the issue that you're raising with this question of sort of matching employers and immigrants from the get-go, because one can anticipate that those that have strong skills in English or French, or English and French, in countries that have education at higher levels, that may that may use those as language of instruction, that those that are sort of connected and maybe well off financially, those are the people that may be able to make use of that more, because often jobs are around contacts and who and those kinds of
But
those kinds of connections.
isn't it fair that Canada should want people who speak one of the two official languages and who have skills that will fulfill a market need? I mean, immigration is a two-way process. I mean, there's benefit to the country and benefit to the immigrants.
Well, I mean, those are things that can be looked at and maybe debated. I mean, historically, there were a lot of people that came to Canada that didn't, have English necessarily.
Yeah.
The other thing historically is that, people, French Canadians in Quebec were really concerned about the number of people that came in that would automatically learn English and they don't learn French. So there's a number of issues that come up around language. Around the idea that maybe people can learn the language when they come to the new country. That's not you know doesn't mean they're not going to eventually learn it. But also, I think the other thing in that is that in emphasizing French and English in practice, those that speak French have really struggled outside of Quebec. So the government, on the one hand, says we'd like people who speak French and English, and then there are immigrants coming from countries of La Francophonie that speak French, and they come to places like Alberta, and they can't access services or other things in French. So those language is a complicated thing. I think it's a complicated thing in the Canadian context. And something that can be debated. But I would just note, historically there were people that didn't necessarily know the language and made their way.
So I have a couple of other questions. One of the questions was in relation to naturalized citizens. So are naturalized citizens effectively second-class citizens?
I mean, if you look at some of the language that has been used to describe Bill C-24, you often come across this idea that naturalized citizens are essentially second-class citizens, or dual citizens may be like second-class citizens because they're under a different kind of observation. In some ways, it's not unusual that there may be distinctions that are made. So, for example, think of something as basic in the United States as who gets to run to be president. You have to be a U.S. born citizen. There's reasons that was, put in place in the U.S. Constitution, but constitutionally they say that. So you cannot run to be president. You cannot be the president of the United States if you're not, if you weren't born in the United States. So you do see these things in different countries, including Western countries. But I think also these are things that are being questioned and challenged. Including in the U.S. around elections, right? There's discussions of Arnold Schwarzenegger, should he be able to run? And we see ways in which these things have been challenged in Canada. So, for example, some people have raised, why is place of birth put on a passport? That becomes a way of differentiating Canadians if you put down place of birth, and something in the order of 20% of Canadian citizens were not born in Canada. So should that even be information that you have to carry around with, because it's like it marks you as different. So those are things that I think are being discussed. I don't think we've settled those issues, but I think in raising them, we're this is a broadening of a human rights conversation and a citizenship rights conversation, and certainly this legislation, Bill C-24, has lent itself to being seen as further differentiating, those that are naturalized from those that are Canadian born.
Thank you. Another question we had was around things that people might get criminalized for. So, for example, there's a proposal by the Conservative Party to criminalize travel to certain countries or certain areas that are designated to have terrorism, terrorist activities, or there could be an attempt to criminalize those who oppose BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions effort. Do you have any comment on this sort of fear that people have that they might be criminalized, and would that have an impact on their citizenship or immigration status?
Well, I mean, again, I think when you've had these changes, and the thing is, they're really recent changes. As I said, Bill C-24 just went into effect in June. Um, there are some legal um, um, challenges that are beginning to be launched against that legislation. And I think when it's actually used, that's when we're going to see more. What does it actually mean? But it's interesting. Like, I was involved in a conversation at the University of Alberta on C-24, on Bill C-24, a few weeks ago, and there was a lawyer from the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Group that was speaking, and she really saw Bill C-24 as contravening some major portions of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. So, I mean, I think the full story on that is going to be, as long as we're in the early stages of the full story on that, in terms of how it might be read by uh, courts and other people. Now, nobody wants to be that test case, right? That's the issue. And I think that's what creates fears in people. Like, how is this legislation going to be used? Was it is it if it's too broad a brush, if it's too broad a brush, could it actually start to criminalize what you might want to call dissent, and dissent being a key aspect of liberal democratic rights and our right to speak in Canada. And so, something like BDS being criminalized, that somehow, of course, the BDS movement is an international movement, boycott, divestment, sanction movement, aimed at the state of Israel for violations against Palestinians. And there has been some discussions sometimes coming out from the Conservative government where they're critical of the BDS movement. It's not necessarily evidently clear to people where that might go, so there are fears. But we haven't seen that explicitly used by the government until, at least yet, to try and take away someone's citizenship or criminalize them. So we have to see, but that's those are real concerns that are out there.
So I'll just thank you once again for your presentation, and I have for the benefit of those watching through the recording, I do encourage you to connect with NCAR, with the Canadian Arab Institute, and of course to check out the Your Voice campaign. You can find us at the following websites: